The very same politicians who told us that Afghanistan was critical, that it was worth dying for, that this was an existential threat to global security, that it was worth having the largest British embassy in the world, 10,000 troops on the ground, suddenly wake up one morning and say it doesn't matter at all. And the United States and Britain was not even prepared to keep 2,500 soldiers and some planes in the country with zero casualties, zero risk over the last few years. I mean, this has been an extraordinary betrayal. In a sense, people were naive about Biden. He said, you know, America's back, instead of which he said America's first.
Rory Stewart, hello.
Hello, good to see you.
Likewise, it's been a pretty extraordinary 18 months since we last met in person.
Yeah.
How you doing?
Well, it's strange. I mean, we last met sitting in the garden of my house, and I thought we were being kind of edgy just sitting in the garden with a bit of distance. And now I look at that video and I think we should have been masked.
Parliament has just finished debating the situation in Afghanistan. Have you caught any of it? Did you see it?
Caught a bit of it. Caught my friend Tom Tugendhat's speech, very moving. Read the Prime Minister's statement. I mean, it's a very, very sad day in every single way because it's a total betrayal of Afghans, but also what President Biden did was very humiliating towards Britain. Basically, he didn't consult, and it was a very small presence in Afghanistan that we could have kept indefinitely. But Britain somehow has got out of the habit of really feeling serious and responsible for these things, and so somehow the US departure meant that we departed in a way that I think has left us all feeling a bit lost.
There's an element of, realism perhaps, having to understand our own military capabilities, our position on the world stage, that, you know, if America's not prepared to go somewhere, particularly now as we retreat from Europe and our traditional allies there, that we kind of have to come to terms with our position in the world and that global Britain potentially isn't all it's cracked up to be.
Well, it's a big question. So we're spending more than 2% of our GDP on defence. It's a lot of money, right? Over £40 billion a year. And what are we going to do with that? What's the point of having tens of thousands of soldiers in a big military if we can't operate independently? Or, if we're going to operate with the US, we'd have to redesign our military to be compatible with the US and just accept that that's what we're going to do. Those are two big strategic choices. Go independent, which is what the French do, go with the US. My problem with Britain is that we seem as usual to be in a muddle in the middle, where in practice we can't operate without the US, it seems, or Afghanistan suggests that, but we pretend we have this huge military with an independent force.
I couldn't help but wonder, watching the speeches in Parliament earlier today, what your contribution might have been if you were still a sitting MP. What is it that you would have liked to have said?
Well, I think I'd firstly, fundamentally, want to talk about Afghans and what they're going through. That this is a horrifying experience for them. That we're talking a lot about military interpreters, but actually there were so many others. Afghan teachers, nurses, doctors, journalists, human rights activists, people who just worked with British charities on the ground, who are now in incredible danger, and who committed to our way of life, who believed in this idea that they would be able to emerge from this Taliban horror and live a better existence, who've been betrayed and to whom we owe a huge moral obligation.
My next question is quite abstract, but it's deliberately abstract. What is Afghanistan?
Afghanistan, when I first saw it 20 years ago, was basically 20,000 villages. There was very little central state. The Taliban government were a few people sitting around in some pretty empty rooms. There wasn't much of a state. I walked from Herat to Kabul, I didn't see any electricity. I was sick in central Afghanistan. It was 3 days' walk from the nearest clinic, and it had no drugs when you got there. So it felt like a very fragmented place. Poor, fragile, 1 in 8 children dying before the age of 5. Adult literacy rates in many areas, close to zero. Maybe 5 out of 100 people could read or write. Move forward 20 years, still fragile, still poor, but over that 20 years, we'd managed to develop things. Many more women were going to school. Young people in Kabul were living lives similar to their contemporaries in India. I was there at the end of last year, and I still felt positive about the country. I still felt we were really achieving things. And all that has been destroyed in the space of a few days.
So the follow-up was going to be, do you think that Afghanistan still exists? But I guess you've semi-answered it there yourself.
Well, so does the Afghanistan that I saw then still exist? I guess the Afghanistan that I knew even 2 weeks ago doesn't exist. I've been looking at footage of streets that I know really well, a building I used to live in, and instead of what I was used to seeing, which is women in headscarves, a busy street, shops open, kids going to school, I'm seeing pickup trucks driving around with Taliban commanders waving Kalashnikovs and rocket-propelled grenade launchers on their shoulder. I feel like we've gone back 20 years to the Afghanistan I saw then.
In 2013, you said, and I'm quoting here, "It's easier as a foreigner to romanticise the country than to actually be an Afghan trapped in it." There were so many aspects of that society which genuinely seemed moving, fulfilling, intriguing, beautiful. Those words kind of, well, they seem a touch prophetic, and they also take on a slightly new meaning, don't they, in the current context?
That is true. And I think people are trapped. I mean, it's an extraordinary country, incredible people, but people are literally trapped. You can't get to the airport at the moment. There are no flights. You can't leave on a land border because Pakistan, Uzbekistan, all these other countries have closed their borders. And you are trapped under a Taliban theocracy. And everything's closed. The schools are closed, the clinics are closed. Your business, if you've got a business, is collapsing. You can't export. All the international money is drying up. You are literally trapped.
The Taliban in Kabul are making encouraging noises, shall we say, about women's rights, about the safety of internationals in terms of potential reprisals or violence. Do you think it's likely that we're going to see a softening of their extremism, or is this just spin? They're aware that the world is watching and are making the right noises?
Well, I think we've got to be realistic about the Taliban. I mean, it's a jihadi group. It's a group that uses suicide bombers, that provided safe haven to Osama bin Laden and had a very brutal record when they were in power. I'm very pleased that they've decided at the moment that they're going on a moderate message. It's very good that they're making efforts. I was hearing today from an Afghan doctor in Kabul that the Taliban had come into her hospital and said you can continue work. That's great, a great beginning. Right? And it's great that they're saying they don't want to provide safe haven to terrorists and they want to reach out. We should try to take this opportunity, but we should do it with very open eyes. We shouldn't be naive about who the Taliban are or what their experience has been for 20 years. But yes, of course, if they are going to chart a moderate course, we should try to give them a chance to do that. If we do the opposite, which is from the very beginning treat them with contempt, lock them in, we will create the nightmare that we fear. We'll create a paranoid, vindictive government, and Afghans will end up much worse off. So I think at the moment, it behoves us to keep an open mind.
I also think as well the pictures that we're seeing coming out, particularly of Kabul airport, of that United States Air Force plane, and the people clinging on for dear life, in some cases tragically falling to their deaths. I think that's a pretty strong indicator of how people on the ground are expecting things to go.
Sure. I mean, it's if you want one indication, if you're prepared to cling to the side of a plane that's taking off and try to hold on when you're 300 feet off the ground, it's very clear. You're basically prepared to take an almost certain risk of death in order to get out of the country. And many people will feel like that. Remember, there were 4 million refugees outside Afghanistan. When I first saw Afghanistan at the end of 2001, end of the Taliban period, 4 million Afghans out of 20 million had chosen to leave the country. And you can expect similar things to happen now. If you are an educated person, you do not want to be living in this society. If you're a woman, you do not want to be living in this society. Now, again, I would like to give the Taliban the benefit of the doubt. They're saying they've changed. They're saying they've changed. And if they have changed, thank goodness, and let's work with them. But many, many Afghans are terrified at the moment.
Just on this point of refugees, the British government's announced that it's going to accept 5,000 Afghan refugees this year. So is that Boris Johnson fulfilling his moral obligation? Job done. We can all go home, right?
No, it's not beginning to fulfill a moral obligation. What we would expect from Boris Johnson and his government is firstly to accept that many of these people are endangered directly because they worked with us. Directly because they worked with us. Right? Even, I was running a charity on the ground in Afghanistan, even people who were closely associated with me would be in danger. It doesn't have to be that they're working with the military. And we have a moral obligation to look after people who we encouraged, women who we encouraged to go to school, journalists who we encouraged to speak out, people who we encouraged to attack the Taliban thinking that we were supporting them. We have a moral obligation towards them. And there are many, many more, I'm afraid, than 5,000. Now, Britain should be working to make an international coalition with Germany, with the United States, with France, to take what will ultimately be spread amongst these countries, hundreds of thousands of people, and Britain should be proud to have these people. They are educated people, they're people who will make a huge contribution to our society. And the numbers we're talking about in the context of the British population will be tiny. But it's certainly much more than 5,000, I'm afraid. That is not a good number.
We'll continue talking about this in the broader context, but to make it personal for a moment, you just mentioned there, people who work for your charity, have worked with you, are at risk. I mean, how are you feeling? Sleepless nights, I'm imagining.
Yeah, it's terrible. And it's genuinely terrible. And terrible, obviously, much more for Afghans who are on the ground, but terrible for all of us who work with Afghanistan. I lived and worked in Afghanistan for 3 years. My wife lived and worked in Afghanistan for 7 years. And as you can imagine, every minute I'm getting text messages and WhatsApp messages and emails from people trying to get to the airport. They can't get through Taliban checkpoints. Sometimes they're hiding in their houses because they think that if they even turn up at a Taliban checkpoint, they'll be arrested, or worse. And they are desperate to get anyone to help them. And we're also thinking that all the investment we put in, we ran a charity for 15 years, we're trying to get the clinic up and running again, trying to get the school up and running again. And we're also worried that the British government, the American government and others who've been supporting ourselves and the United Nations and Save the Children and all these other agencies on the ground are going to cut all the funding, which will suddenly mean that millions of Afghans are worse off. It won't have any impact on the Taliban government, but millions of Afghans will suddenly find themselves without healthcare and education, basic support. So it's a terrible time.
Some, including President Biden, have suggested that if the Afghans didn't want to fight for their own country, why should anyone else? That their capitulation in recent days amounts to cowardice. I mean, what's your response to that?
Well, it's deeply, deeply offensive. I mean, it's incredibly offensive. The United States provided all the air support for the Afghans. They didn't just take their own planes away. They took away 16,000 civilian contractors who were maintaining the Afghan helicopters. Right, took them out of the country so those things couldn't even fly. And the morale damage they left in the middle of the night from Bagram, I didn't even tell the commander that they were leaving. The Afghans woke up in the morning, all their planes disabled, the Americans have left, no support of any kind. And you're asking who exactly? Who is President Biden asking to fight? I mean, if you are an Afghan woman teaching in a school in Puli-Charki, really? Really? I mean, what are they expecting? A bunch of guys come riding in pickup trucks with heavy machine guns into your town? You don't want the Taliban in there, you don't support them. But if you're genuinely asking them to put up a suicidal fight when the United States and Britain was not even prepared to keep 2,500 soldiers and some planes in the country with zero casualties, zero risk over the last few years, I mean, this has been an extraordinary betrayal. Right? It's difficult to get the figures, but as far as one can tell, no US serviceman has been killed in Afghanistan for 18 months. No British serviceman for longer than that. This has not been a costly mission since 2014. This was the easiest thing to continue to do for the Afghan people. There was absolutely no reason to do this. To do this, to basically hand them over to the Taliban and then say, it's your fault, you're all a bunch of cowards, when we pulled out and weren't prepared to accept a tiny presence. We have 10 times the number of people who've been in South Korea in the US military for 70 years. Do we think taking them out is going to be smart? Right, nothing's going to happen if you suddenly take them out? This idea that because you haven't sorted everything in 20 years means you have to just walk away. What are we going to do? Okay, so we haven't sorted North and South Korea in 70 years. Take the troops out. I mean, it's insanity.
Comparisons have been drawn to the fall of Saigon, particularly sort of ironic or comic in the light of Secretary of State Blinken's remarks, which was, this is not Saigon. I mean, do you think that's a fair comparison? Do you think there are parallels?
There are parallels in the sense that it is the most extraordinary humiliation of the West, and the imagery is the same, but the total difference is the Americans were forced to leave South Vietnam. They were hemorrhaging lives. It was an incredibly toxic political issue. There were hundreds of thousands of people in the streets demonstrating, demanding withdrawal. And it was one of the most costly interventions the Americans did, and they couldn't fight the North Vietnamese army. This is, by comparison, totally different. 2,500 soldiers, almost no casualties, almost no cost, and a little bit of air support. They weren't driven out of the country. They could have remained indefinitely. So it's extraordinary. We've brought this on ourselves. In Saigon, at least you can say, okay, the Americans needed to leave because this whole thing was blowing up. They couldn't keep it going. In Afghanistan, we had an elected Afghan government that, yeah, there were many problems. There was corruption, the police were useless, obviously the Afghan Air Force didn't operate. But by and large, given how poor and fragile that country was, it was making progress. Afghan lives are much better than they were 20 years ago. All we were being asked to do, having gone into that country in the first place, was to keep a tiny presence on the ground to stop the Taliban from taking over the country.
As a former International Development Secretary, can you contextualise this in relation to the recent cut to the international aid budget? Because we're also reducing the amount of cash money that we're providing Afghanistan with, right?
So 76% cut last year in our international aid to Afghanistan, which means that suddenly we were in a position in which now, when there's a humanitarian emergency, when refugees need to be looked after, when people need to be fed, when schools need to keep running, there is no British assistance to provide. And we've capped our aid at 0.5%, so apparently there's no extra money either. So this is a government that boasts about global Britain, about being generous, about putting out a good hand, but where's the evidence? Troops out, money out, support out. And as though the whole last 20 years has been forgotten. The very same politicians who told us that Afghanistan was critical, that it was worth dying for, that this was an existential threat to global security, that it was worth having the largest British embassy in the world, 10,000 troops on the ground, suddenly wake up one morning and say it doesn't matter at all. Right? Where's the middle ground in this? Where's the moderation? Right? Obviously, it may not have mattered as much as they said in the past. That doesn't mean it didn't matter at all. Obviously, they didn't achieve as much as they pretended in the past. That doesn't mean they didn't achieve nothing. Why are we incapable of getting out of this black and white mindset? Why can't we find a middle ground that says we had a light, sustainable footprint, we were making slow progress, it wasn't costing us very much, it was the very least we could do for the Afghan people?
Donald Trump obviously negotiated a peace agreement with the Taliban. Joe Biden has kind of followed through on that agreement. Who's more to blame in your eyes between the two of them?
Joe Biden. Joe Biden. Donald Trump in the end didn't do this. He wanted to do it. He tried to do it in Syria and Afghanistan, but in the end he was talked down by the foreign policy establishment generals. He kept tweeting out he was going to get all the troops out, and in the end they didn't let him do it. And actually, in a sense, people were naive about Biden. The same generals and diplomats thought, okay, well, breathe a sigh of relief, Trump's gone. So we can actually show Biden the options that we didn't show Trump. We can give them three options, in normal Goldilocks, two stupid options, one good option. Stupid option one, we'll put in 100,000 troops. Stupid option two, we'll leave entirely. Proper option, we'll keep muddling along doing roughly what we're doing at the moment. They never imagined for a moment that he'd go the full Trump on this. He said, you know, America's back, instead of which he said America's first.
In 2011, I'm going to quote you again, you said, Afghanistan does not pose an existential threat to global security. It's extremely unlikely the Taliban would ever be able to take over the country. Extremely unlikely they'll be able to seize Kabul. They simply don't have a conventional military option. And even if they were able to do so, even if I'm wrong, it's extremely unlikely the Taliban would invite back Al-Qaeda. From the Taliban's point of view, that was their number one mistake last time. If they hadn't invited back Al-Qaeda, they would still be in power today. Obviously, I think the second part of that statement rings true. The first one hasn't. Why should we listen to you now if that prediction hasn't come true?
So you're absolutely right. I was arguing for keeping a light long-term footprint. So if you continue with that article, what I'm saying is that the reason the Taliban didn't have a conventional military option is because of planes, because of the Air Force. So every time they tried to move tanks or artillery up the main streets, they could be hit from the air. It never occurred to me for a moment that somebody was going to suggest taking out the air support which prevented the Taliban from posing that conventional military attack, right? When it's taken out, yes, of course, they could repeat what they did in the 1990s, which is literally roll artillery and tanks up the main streets. Now, whether the second bit is true or not, I don't know. That was my assessment of the Taliban in 2011. Right? We're now 10 years on. I think there is a strong possibility that they might well start flirting with jihadi groups. The jihadis will see this now as a huge shot in the arm. This is probably the biggest jihadi victory since ISIS in Syria and Iraq in 2013, 2014. President Biden thinks he's ended the global war on terror. There's a risk that he's just given it another decade of life.
I opened this conversation by asking you, what is Afghanistan? And my own answer to that probably would have been the graveyard of empires. And I think that's a product of always viewing the country through the lens of a history lesson. You know, whether it's the Victorians, the Cold War, or more recently, American hegemony. Do you think we'll look back on this moment as when China became truly ascendant and the West fell?
I think we'll look back at it as a very, very big nail in the coffin of Western credibility. I mean, the problem started earlier. The problem started really as China broke through and showed that it could become this very prosperous country without becoming a democracy. It's been seen in Africa over the last 10 years where countries have turned away from Western democratic models and started looking more towards countries like China. We had the humiliations of Syria and the Arab Spring and Iraq, but this is extraordinary. This is very self-inflicted. It's very easy now for China and Russia to say, you can't rely on these people. And this is the first time the US has actually done something like this, really since the Second World War. Because despite all the changes in administration, US foreign policy, defense policy was pretty constant. They knew who their allies were, they stuck by them. To do something so arbitrary, so cheap, so destructive, I think is going to be very, very bad. And it's going to leave American allies like Britain reeling and bewildered. Next time we're asked to go in, next time we're asked to pin our credibility to this mission, can we trust that the US is going to stick with it? Or are they going to do this again? Leave without consulting. President Biden, after the fall of Kabul, didn't call any Western leader until this morning. He couldn't even be bothered to pick up the telephone. And that leaves a very, very sour taste in the mouth, because it's exposed our own impotence. It's exposed that Britain wasn't able to create its own coalition, step into the breach, or even receive the courtesy of a phone call.
Rory Stewart, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. Great to see you again.
Thank you.